Welcome to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And today we're going back to the Hittite Empire in the reign of Mursili II to take a look at the Battle of Ganuvara in 1312 BCE. There's just one problem. We know almost nothing about this battle. Because, as you might have noticed from our previous episodes, almost all the battles we've looked at so far involved the kings who personally fought in or commanded them. After all, it was the kings who decided to go to war in the Bronze Age, and it was the kings who commissioned the records that tell us about their wars, or more accurately, their victories. And Mursili II, the king who led last week's battle of the Astarpa River in 1319 BCE, was still king for Ganuvara. But he wasn't there for the battle. Instead, he sent his cupbearer Nuvanza to deal with the problem. And we don't know anything about him either. So we're going to have to make up pretty much every detail for this battle. But before we get into it, we're going to spend a little time on terms. Because you've heard me talk about heavy and light infantry and heavy and light cavalry in earlier episodes. And I've tried to define those terms briefly as I used them, but we've never talked about it in detail. So today, we're going to fix that. Someday, I'll do a background episode or several about this subject, but for today, this is what you get. So first of all, what do we mean when we talk about infantry and cavalry? Well, in general terms, the job of infantry is to take ground and hold ground. The job of cavalry is to move fast in support of the infantry. That's true whether we're talking about dudes with spears and shields or laser-guided munitions. Specifically in the Bronze Age, that means the infantry fights on foot and the cavalry fights from chariots or on horseback. Yes, infantry can sometimes move fast and cavalry can sometimes take ground. But in general, this is what we've got. But I told you I was going to go into detail. So here we go. Infantry fights on foot. But there are a lot of different ways to do that. So we divide the infantry into two general categories: light infantry and heavy infantry. We tell these guys apart not by what they carry or what they wear or how much training or discipline they have, even though there is usually a difference, but by how close they get to the enemy. Of course, you can usually tell by the other things too, because that main question drives a lot of other factors like equipment and training. But it's the mission that drives the equipment, not the other way around. So most of the time, the fiercest combat on the battlefield is going to be centered around the heavy infantry. These are the guys with spears and shields who form a line and close with the enemy to try to destroy them and drive them off the field. They'll usually be wearing some kind of armor to protect them, and usually a helmet as well. If you remember, pretty much the first piece of armor we ever saw was the copper helmets the infantry wore in the stele of vultures, way back in 2450 BCE for the Battle of Umma. In addition to their spears, your heavy infantryman is probably going to be carrying another weapon like a mace, an axe, or a sword, because spears break or they get stuck, or the other guys turn and run and show you their unarmored side, and a fella needs another option when that happens. Heavy infantry is also going to have some of the most thorough training and discipline on the battlefield, because an isolated individual is easy to kill. But a formation made up of individuals exerting a coordinated effort to accomplish a goal is not. And in order to do that, guys need training. So guys need to know how to keep their lines straight, how to keep gaps from opening, and to fill holes when the guy in front of them or next to him goes down. So they train to do that, and train, and train, and train. And they need to be able to do those things when the world is going to complete shit around them. When guys are screaming and shouting, their sandals broken, their buddies wounded, and they've got sand in their eyes, and they can't even think because these crazy motherfuckers in front of them just won't stop coming. So they train some more until pretty much everything that happens up to the moment of contact is routine and boring. That's heavy infantry. They get up close and personal. What about the light guys? Well, light infantry's job is to kill people and direct them toward the heavy guys. They usually do that with ranged weapons like bows or javelins or slings. They usually won't be wearing armor, or if they are, it'll be something light that doesn't interfere with operating their weapon. They'll form up behind the heavy infantry or to the flanks, or they'll occupy positions covering broken ground to keep enemy infantry from getting around their own guys' flanks. You'll often see them deployed out in front of the main line as skirmishers whose job is to shoot missiles at the enemy to slow them down and cause casualties before they can get to the line of heavies. These guys aren't supposed to stand and resist an enemy charge. They shoot until the enemy gets close, then they run away. And if the commander is doing his job right, the heavy infantry is there to take the handoff when that happens. Like I said, light infantry isn't supposed to stand and fight. That means they don't need the armor and shield the heavies have. And in many cases, they come to the fight with whatever weapons they use for hunting or protecting their herds at home. These guys are your levies, your draftees from rural areas, farmers and shepherds who don't need a lot of training because they already know how to use their weapons. For the most part, the only training they need is a lesson on how to tell the good guys from the bad guys so they don't shoot their own side. They're on every battlefield and they almost never show up in the records because they don't live and die at the decisive point on the battlefield. But their missiles are indispensable for driving the enemy toward that decisive point and for weakening them before they get there so the friendly heavies stand a better chance of overwhelming them. So heavy infantry kills people and stands there, and light infantry kills people and runs away. Why would an army use heavy infantry at all? Well, some didn't. If you remember the Nubians from Kerma or the Indo-Aryans from the Ten Kings, their armies were weighted much more heavily toward light infantry, archers, than heavy infantry. And that often works. Armies like that can be a nightmare for heavy infantry because they won't stand and fight. And that can stretch conflicts out until the heavies have no choice but to give up and go home. The problem comes when you get into a situation where you can't run away anymore. When that happens, the heavies suddenly have the advantage again. Because you don't really own a piece of ground until you can put guys there who don't have to run away when they're attacked. And when light troops are forced to stand and fight against heavy troops, it usually doesn't end well for the light guys. So that'll cover the infantry. What about cavalry? Well, cavalry's greatest strength, especially in the Bronze Age, is not destructive power or shock effect. It's mobility. A guy on a horse or in a chariot can move a lot faster than a guy on his feet, which means he can shoot arrows or throw javelins at the heavy infantry without having to worry that they'll catch him. A unit of chariots can literally ride circles around the heavy infantry, and unless the infantry has chariots supporting it, it can't do a thing about it, except try to get to a place where the chariots can't reach it. Because chariots have a significant disadvantage over horse cavalry. Trying to operate them anywhere but on flat ground is going to break them. And they're expensive, and breaking them is something you would prefer to avoid. So if the infantry can get to rocky ground or up on a hill or a muddy field, chariots are going to have a hard time getting to them. And chariots are mostly filling the role of light cavalry in the Bronze Age, keeping their distance and attacking with missile weapons, mostly javelins and bows, in support of the heavy infantry. Light cavalry is a lot like light infantry, but faster. They don't close with the enemy, they cause casualties and sow confusion from a distance. When we get to the Iron Age, we'll see the Assyrians using mounted archers in that role. And later we'll see the Persians using the first proper horse archers, a type of unit that's going to give Western armies fits pretty much until gunpowder takes over the battlefield. And we do know Bronze Age armies used troops mounted on horseback, but mostly as messengers. The technology of riding or of shooting made it too difficult to shoot a bow from horseback in the Bronze Age. So what about heavy cavalry? Well, we don't really see it in the Bronze Age except for one example, the Hittite heavy chariot. And I mentioned this last time, but I want to talk about it again. So most chariots in the Bronze Age were built for speed and maneuverability. Wheels and bodies were light. The sidewalls made of wicker or bark or leather to protect the guys inside from arrows and sling stones, but not much protection from anything heavier. The crew was generally limited to two, a driver and an archer. Wheels are usually mounted toward the back of the basket to make the whole unit more stable at high speed. A heavy spear stuck in the spokes of the wheels could take a chariot right out of the fight, so they preferred to avoid heavy spears. The Hittites took a different approach with their chariots, starting in about the 14th century BCE, the period we're talking about today. They built their chariots with wooden walls to protect them from heavier weapons. They put 3 guys in the back instead of 2, adding a shield bearer and giving the archer a spear or an axe or a sword instead of just a bow. And all 3 of them wore armor, and maybe the horses as well. They moved the wheels under the middle of the basket to take some of the added weight off of the horses, which meant they couldn't move nearly as fast as their lighter cousins. Now, the purpose of heavy cavalry is to close with and destroy the enemy with destructive power and shock effect. Good heavy cavalry can punch a hole through a line of infantry that friendly infantry can then exploit. But how do you do that with a chariot? With your propulsion system, your horses, in front of your weapon system, your spear, how do you attack an infantry line without endangering your entire vehicle? Because after all, if one of your horses goes down dead or injured, or your chariot throws a wheel, the 3 guys in the back just became infantry. Poorly equipped infantry. Well, that didn't make sense to me for a long time. But then I finally realized, even the best infantryman doesn't want to stand in front of a charging horse. Unless you train him to the point that he no longer values his own life, or somehow organize your line so he physically can't move, or both, he's going to move. But now your charioteer has a whole nother problem, because he doesn't actually want a collision. He wants the infantry to get the hell out of the way, because if the infantry doesn't move, the best that can happen is his horses manage to knock him down without injuring themselves, which is very unlikely. Much more likely result of a collision like that is the horses go down, wounded or lamed or dead, and the chariot's damaged, but now there are 3 guys in the middle of an infantry line, and they're probably injured too. And unless the horses have blinders on, they might not even be willing to get close enough for a collision. Because horses don't like to run at spiky walls any more than you do, and they're not smart enough to understand there might be a good reason to do it. So the charioteer doesn't want a collision. He wants to play chicken, and he wants the other guy to flinch before his horses decide to stop. It's a gamble, and it's one the Hittites decided to accept, and it worked for them for a while. And there's one more situation where cavalry of all kinds and even light infantry comes in very handy. Pursuit of a defeated enemy. We've talked in previous episodes about how the bulk of casualties in Bronze Age battle happen when one side breaks and runs. And these guys are a big reason why. See, when the enemy line breaks and the guys start to run, the heavy infantry who's in contact is going to try to pursue. But they, or at least the guys in the front line, don't have much left. They're smoked. They're going to have to go slow, at least for a while, so they can catch their breath. Because hand-to-hand combat is exhausting. And if you're wearing heavy protective gear, you're probably going to roll into pursuit slowly, grateful for a minute or 2 just to breathe. But the cavalry and the light infantry haven't been engaged in the same way as the heavies. And the enemy's backs are now turned, making them easier to kill. Hell, if they're really panicked, they've dropped their weapons and their shields and maybe even pulled their helmets off so they can run faster. So the messengers on horseback probably get to them first, galloping after them with axes or maces or daggers or sickle swords. Then it's the chariots nipping at the flanks with their hand weapons or shooting arrows at them. Then the light infantry shooting arrows or slinging stones and bullets, which bullets are just sling projectiles that are made out of clay, until they get close enough to start using their hand weapons. Sometimes a group of fleeing enemies might rally and turn to fight, or an isolated group discovers they're trapped and they have no choice but to try and fight their way out. Then archers and slingers can still keep doing damage, but in most cases, most of the enemy is going to get away unless the heavy infantry is close enough to come up and deal with them. Or they'll try to surrender, in which case their fate will depend on whoever they surrender to. Some Bronze Age cultures would just kill captives outright. Some would kill high-ranking captives and take the rest as slaves. and some would take them all as slaves, maybe sacrificing a few in thanks to their gods. From what we've seen so far, the Hittites seem to have preferred to take slaves, while the Egyptians like to kill at least their high-ranking prisoners. So that's a little bit about infantry and cavalry. Let's talk about the Battle of Ganuvara. So we talked about the Hittites and their king Mursili II last week. And here's a quick recap. Mursili II came to the Hittite throne unexpectedly after a plague killed his father and his brother in the late 1320s BCE. Before his father, Suppiluliuma I, took the throne, the Hittite Empire was kind of in the shitter, with enemies nibbling at it from all sides. But Suppiluliuma got things under control, managed to stop the bleeding, and even reconquered a lot of the Hittites' former territory. Then he went and died of what historians think was probably tularemia, which also killed his son Nuvanza II something like 18 months later. So Mursili was young when he took the throne in 1321 BCE, and his ascension was something of a surprise to everybody. And the Hittites' enemies, as they usually did in this period, started talking shit and revolting against the new king's authority. And Mursili immediately started smacking them down. Within 3 years, he had subdued the Casca to the north and completely conquered the Arzawa to the west with the help of a little divine intervention in the form of a meteorite that may have hit the Arzawan king Uhazzidi in the knee. So by 1318 BCE, Mursili was firmly in charge of the Hittite Empire. But that doesn't mean things were hunky-dory. The Casca, a mountain confederation that he never managed to fully conquer, started to bow up again around 1316 BCE, so he went north again to deal with them. Then in 1314, a kingdom to the south called Nuvanza rose up, possibly supported by the Egyptians, so he had to send somebody to deal with that. At about the same time, the Casca managed to get together under a war leader who called himself their king, which was a pretty big surprise to everybody who knew anything about the Casca. He managed to take a few northern Hittite towns before Mursili spanked his ass down and captured him. And that was the last Mursili would hear of the Casca as more than a nuisance. But shit was going down all over the southern and eastern borders of his empire. His guys were getting a good handle on the situation in Nuvanza, but the Assyrians were making noise to the southeast, and a tribe called the Hayasa-Azzi were making trouble in the northeast. So let's talk about the Hayasa-Azzi for a minute. These guys lived in the mountains between modern-day Turkey and Armenia, and are probably one of the ancestor peoples to modern-day Armenians. It looks like Suppiluliuma had brought them into the empire by defeating them and then marrying a Hittite princess to their king, who he later had to kill for breaching his marriage contract. Then he married his sister to the next king, Aniyash, and things stayed relatively quiet until Mursili came to power. Then, while Mursili was busy with the Casca and the Arzawa and the Nuvanza, the Hayasa-Azzi took a couple of Hittite outposts, including the city of Ganuvara, and refused to release the prisoners they'd captured. Well, of course, Mursili couldn't just let that go, but he had other problems. His brother, who had been serving as his viceroy in Syria, died, allowing the Nuvanza and the Assyrians to get aggressive again. So in 1312 BCE, Mursili had to make a decision. Did he go south to Syria or north to Hayasa-Azzi? And whichever he chose, who should he send to deal with the other one? The second question was probably easier to answer. A Bronze Age king doesn't have that many experienced military commanders he can trust to carry out a campaign on their own. So the guy he picked for the other campaign was his cupbearer, Nuvanza. Now, it's not entirely clear to me what a cupbearer was in the Bronze Age Near East. This is the second time we've heard of this position. If you remember back to the episode on Sargon of Akkad, it was the position he held before he started conquering southern Mesopotamia. And you can be sure everybody who held that title after him remembered that. And so did the kings they worked for. So even though it sounds like a servant's title, the cupbearer would have been a highly regarded position. Maybe a little like a chief of staff today. He may have poured wine for the king's high-ranking guests, but imagine what a position of trust that was. If the king or his guest went down from poison or even got sick, the guy who poured the wine would be the first one suspected. You can imagine the scenario might have gone a little like this. The cupbearer pours the wine. Then he drinks first to show the whole group that it's not poisoned. Then the king drinks as the host. Then the guests, confident nobody's trying to poison them, are free to drink. Over thousands of years, this sort of thing probably became something very close to a religious ritual, and the cupbearer was in charge of it. That would have made him something like a priest and high-ranking servant rolled into one. And his proximity to the king and the trust the king had to invest in him would have made him a close advisor, servant or not. And kings have a way of assigning critical missions to people they can trust. Now, where a cupbearer learns how to lead troops, I'm not sure. But Nuvanza seems to have been up to the challenge. No shit. There they were. The BS meter for this story is about 8 out of 10. We have names and approximate dates, but I've had to make up most of the details. So there was nobody Mursili trusted more than Nuvanza. Because as many wars as he had had to fight, diplomacy had been just as important. And Nuvanza had never let him down, always knowing when and how much to pour to keep his guests comfortable. Maybe a little more if somebody was getting jolly and nearing an agreement. Maybe a little less wine and a little more food, or maybe calling in a courtesan or two if somebody was getting belligerent. And he had traveled on campaign with Mursili many times, and with Suppiluliuma before him. So he had come to understand a little bit about which generals he could trust and how to deploy troops. So Nuvanza was the obvious choice, along with a couple of experienced generals to help fill in any gaps in military experience. And Mursili was on the verge of announcing his decision in 1312 BCE when the gods sent him a signal that made him clear it was the right one. Just a few days after the summer solstice, the sun went dark in the middle of the afternoon. And here's the thing about signs from the gods. They're usually vague enough that the king or his priest can put whatever meaning he wants on them. In this case, everybody in Anatolia would have seen the eclipse, so Mursili needed to address it anyway. What better way than to claim it as the gods showing approval for what he had already decided to do? So he sent Nuvanza and his army off to Hayasa-Azzi with a huge ceremony and his blessing, while he turned south to make sure his chosen viceroy could take his seat in Syria without too much interference from the Assyrians or the Egyptians or the Nuhasa. Well, for his part, Nuvanza was excited to take on his first solo military command. He had issued a few orders in Mursili's name before, but never with the king so far away. They climbed into the mountains in late June and early July, heading for Ganuvara. If they could relieve the city, Mursili had told Nuvanza, that would deal with most of Aniash's army, and Nuvanza could add the troops inside the city to his own if he needed to pursue the Hayasa-Azzi any farther. 3 days from Ganuvara, one of Nuvanza's patrols captured a couple of Azzi foragers, who after a little encouragement told Nuvanza that the city hadn't fallen yet, but Aniash knew he was coming and would be ready for him when he got there. To their credit, they wouldn't tell him how many troops Aniash had, or how they were deployed, or how Aniash planned to fight him when he got there. So Nuvanza set out to find the answers himself. He camped his army and sent scouts into the hills around Ganuvara to get eyes on the Hayasa-Azzi and find out how many men they had and how close they were to taking the city. Well, the news the scouts brought back was not as good as Nuvanza could have wanted. Aniash had something like 10,000 men and another 1,000 chariots, and they had ladders ready to assault the city. The scouts hadn't been able to get close enough to see what conditions were like inside the city itself, but if the Hayasa-Azzi were getting ready for an assault, they probably thought it was ready to fall. Nuvanza didn't have much time, and Aniash's numbers were pretty close to his own. But Mursili hadn't sent him to sit around wondering what to do. He had about the same number of troops as Aniash, and his chariots were bigger and heavier, and if the troops inside Ganuvara were in a condition to fight, hopefully they would come out and help when the Hayasa-Azzi were busy with Nuvanza's army. So he gave the order to march. No point rushing in to try and surprise an enemy who knew he was coming, so he ordered units to stay together and march in large enough groups that they could deploy into line of battle as soon as they reached the plain in front of the city. It had exposed them to a little greater risk of ambush, but if Aniash wanted to attack as soon as his troops started to appear, it would allow him to deploy a little quicker. He traded security on the march for mass and maneuver when he got to the battlefield. It took them 2 days to get to their final camp just out of sight from the city, and they lay down in marching order and lit no fires so they could get on the road that much quicker in the morning. And on the morning of the battle, Nuvanza had his troops up an hour before dawn and had a march without drums to the field, where they formed up just as quietly as they could. Then, as the sun cleared the peaks to the east, he had his drummers and musicians start playing, and the Hayasa-Azzi troops found their breakfast interrupted by Hittite war music. Because Aniash was also an early riser, and he had told his generals to be prepared for a battle today, to have the men fed and be formed up and waiting for the Hittites when they arrived on the battlefield. But he hadn't expected the Hittites to arrive while it was still dark. So now the Hayasa-Azzi, already wearing their armor and carrying their weapons, had to wolf down their food or go without and scramble to get into their battle lines. Well, they almost made it. Because one thing Nuvanza and Mursili had both learned from Suppiluliuma was not to let an advantage get away from you. While the Hayasa-Azzi lines were still forming, Nuvanza let his archers and slingers start loosing their volleys. And when it looks like the lines were coming together in spite of the bombardment, and the Hayasa-Azzi had their shields up to deflect the arrows and the bullets, he ordered his infantry forward. Aniash had formed up his chariots in the flat ground next to the city. Then his infantry's right flank protected by the chariots, and his left on a little rise not quite a mile from the walls. He held about 1,000 guys in reserve, blocking the town's main gate until he needed them to reinforce the line. So Nuvanza lined up his heavy chariots on his left flank, behind the infantry, and doubled the depth of his infantry formation on that side. And just before his infantry made contact, one of Nuvanza's horse messengers noticed 3 guys in full armor and weapons waving from the walls of the city. The men inside were ready to fight or would be soon. The Hayasa-Azzi chariots just couldn't resist the tempting target he had offered them when he left his infantry's left flank uncovered. So they rushed forward just as the infantry lines came together, which was the cue for the Hittite chariots to charge them. Well, horses don't like to stand still for collisions any more than humans do, and they don't understand the finer points of our languages. So you can't make them understand their sacrifices for a good cause. They're just going to get the fuck out of the way. So the heavy Hittite chariots scattered the lighter Hayasa-Azzi chariots before they could do much damage to the infantry. But they didn't stop there. They charged the Hayasa-Azzi reserve, which was mostly facing away from them, to block the Ganuvarans from coming out to join the battle. Well, the reserve managed to get turned around and form a couple of lines before the chariots reached them. So the chariots halted and started turning around them in a tight oval to keep their attention and keep the horses from getting nervous. Meanwhile, the Ganuvarans opened the gate, and 500 new troops fell on the reserve's rear. Well, that was enough for the reserves, and they broke and ran with the Ganuvarans in pursuit. 100 Hittite chariots took off after them, while the rest turned again to engage any enemy chariots that decided it would be a good idea to come back to the fight. And to attack the Hayasa-Azzi right flank, of course, which was now hanging out in the breeze. And pressed by the infantry to their front, and now chariots attacking their flank and their rear, the right flank just dissolved, and the rest of the army followed. Unfortunately, Aniash escaped, but almost half of his army was killed or taken prisoner. Ganuvara was safe, not too much the worse for wear from the siege. Nuvanza made arrangements to get grain to him before winter. The stores he had captured from the Hayasa-Azzi helped with that, and started his army back down toward Hattusa. And he sent several mounted messengers to find the king and let him know he had accomplished his mission. It took another campaign for Mursili to finally bring Aniash down, and it was another year after that before the Hayasa-Azzi finally surrendered. But they never rose up against Mursili after that. And while we only have good records for about the first 10 years of his reign, it looks like he ruled for about 25 years in total and left a much bigger empire to his successor than his father and brother had left to him. He died sometime around 1295 BCE, leaving the empire to his son, Muwatalli II, who would face Ramses II at Kadesh in 1274 BCE. Well, surprise, surprise, no scorecard this week. We know Nuvanza won the battle and about how many dudes he faced, but that's about it. So rather than evaluate my own tactics, I'm going to leave this section out this time. So that's the Battle of Ganuvara. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this war story, please give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And go find that one friend you think would enjoy this and send it to them. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.